Welcome to the sixth episode in our Linux series. Today we will be exploring the benefits for managing groups on a Linux machine. First, I want to answer some common questions relating to group management before we get started. So, first question I'd like to address is why do we want to manage groups? Well, each user in Linux is a part of a group. And groups are a great way to manage access to resources either on just your local machine or on a server. So you can default user accounts to a particular group, which is useful, as I mentioned, for enabling them access to particular resources, and it'll give them permissions by default for those resources. Now these permissions can be read, write, or execute, and we'll go more into that later. So how do we know what groups exist on our local machine before we get started? So on Linux, there are actually a lot of default groups, and you can check them by checking the etc/group file in order to learn what groups are already set up on your distribution. Let's give it a try. Now we'll do cat etc group. As you can see, we have a whole assortment of results here. So, we can see the contents of the file, and each line has a special representation in this file. And if you scroll up, you'll notice there are a lot of groups, such as a root group, daemon group. Even if we go down here, we could see sudo group for users that are a part of the sudo or that can use sudo commands, so they could be administrators. If we go down, we also can see the users group. For example, I'm a part of that group, my account is. So some useful information here. Now let's go ahead and go back down to the bottom. And we're going to go over this line right here. This is each user has their own group. So that might sound interesting and might not make complete sense to you, but think of it this way, uh, groups can be anything. It could be a sales department, it could be like an admin group, or a group can be a user, and maybe that user has multiple user accounts that they use as services, and then those services are then assigned to that group. So that might be how you would use a users group in particular. But let's go over the contents of this file now. So you may notice right here, this is actually the group name. And actually, you know what? Let's go up. I'm going to use a better example. We'll do the users because it is more readable. So here, as you can see, I have users group, and we can see some contents from the file based on that users group. We can see some very useful information. The first field is the group name. So this is the users group. And then we have some other information here. So groups in Linux actually have passwords. And you can assign a group to have a password if you so desire. Maybe if you need, you know, some extra securities. But in this case, the X represents that there is no password listed in this file. And then as you can see, our next parameter, and in between these parameters, we have these colons. So each colon represents a distinct parameter for that group. In this case, it goes group name, then it goes group password, and then we have group ID. And a group ID is assigned to a group when it is created. And typically when a group is created, it'll use the next available GID or group ID. And in this case, this one is just assigned 100. And you may notice there are some different ones. So, sometimes they're assigned a particular ID for a reason. And in our last section, we have the user list. So, for example, here, I am a part of the users group, and that is why I'm listed here. And if we scroll up, we'll see here's the ADM group, and we actually have syslog, which I mentioned in the last episode, that services are also users. And then we can see my user account name. So we're both a part of the ADM group. So this file is very useful for seeing what groups are on your system. the ID for that group, as well as what users are associated with that group. Now, the next thing I would like to do with you guys is I'd like to go over how to add groups. Now, we can use various commands, and in this case, we're going to use a groupadd. And this allows you to add all sorts of groups, pretty much whatever is the limit of your imagination. So you could think like admins group, sales department group, um, developers group, etc. Like it goes on and on, basically whatever group you can think of. So let's go ahead and create a group right now. So we're going to create the admins group just as an example. So let's do sudo, and you're going to want to use sudo here in case you don't already have permissions to be adding this group. If you're in your sudo account, you might be able to add it easily. But if you aren't in your sudo account, you're going to want to make sure to prefix the commands with sudo here. So we'll do sudo groupAdd, and then we'll do admins. And actually, before we finish with that command, let me go ahead and use the manual on groupAdd so we can learn a little bit more about it. So we can see it's a system management command, and it creates a new group, and we can see some other information. It goes over, for example, what characters are allowed and what characters are not allowed, and how many characters a group name could be. All very useful information. If you're writing a script that uses this command, you're going to want to make sure that you have everything you need to run the script without errors. And if you don't make sure to check for things like the length of the characters for the group name in your script, you may get an error. So some things to note there that are pretty important. We can scroll down, you can see there are some options, such as -g or --gid, which assigns a numerical value to the group ID if it's available. We can go down even further, and you could define a password for that group. And we could go down even further, and you could have a list of usernames to add as members of the group using -uppercase-u or --users. So you have a couple options here. And actually, today I hit Q to get out of that. We're going to get started, like I mentioned, adding the group admins. So let's go ahead and do sudo groupAdd admins. And now here it's prompting for my password since I'm working from an account that's not always considered with sudo permissions. There we go, I just mistyped it. And now if we look at the etc/group file, we'll be able to see that it's been updated with a new group, being the admins group. So let's go ahead and check that out. So I'll clear, and then we'll cat etc group file. If we look here, notice there's a new group that's been appended to the end of the file. And in this case, it's the admins group, and they have no password because we didn't assign a password anyways. And then we have the GID or group identifier, which it's assigned to the next available ID in this case, which is 1001. And like I mentioned, you may notice there are some that are already assigned numbers over 1,000. So typically, as long as it's available, you can assign the GID to whatever number you please. But and then we have an empty column because there are no users a part of this group. Now we're going to be going over how to add users to groups and removing them from groups, but we're going to get into that after we've already gone over the necessary commands in order to edit these groups, like adding them and removing them. So let's go ahead and clear the console. And now what we're going to do is we're going to remove this group. So we've added this group to our system, and now we want to remove it. So actually, we can use the group delete command, and it would go something like this. But like I mentioned, before we do that, let's go ahead and use the manual on the group delete in order to learn more about it. So it's another system management command, and it deletes a group, as we mentioned. And this one has a little less options here. You could, use the force option to force the removal of this group, even if like a user is having that group or part of that group and it may cause issues. And there are a couple other options such as help and so on. and even gives you some more information about like the exit values and so on. This is particularly helpful if you're using it for a script. You can capture that exit value and have your script react to it in some way. So I know we went over scripting in an earlier episode, and I plan on continuing our development of scripts in order to learn more about what these scripts can do. But let's go ahead and just quit this for now by hitting Q. We're actually going to delete the group now. So let's go ahead and do sudo group delete, and then we're going to do admins. And there's no output, but in this instance, that's good. It's good there's no output, there's no errors. Now let's go ahead and read the group file here. And this will let us know if the group has actually been removed in the system. And here we are. In the last entry of the line, we no longer have that group. Now you could use sudo group delete and remove an assortment of these groups, but just keep in mind you're taking a risk here because services are a part of groups, and services rely on the permissions of those groups in order to do changes in the system that they need to do or execute certain programs or files. We're actually going to get into permissions in this episode. So we're going over a lot this episode. We're going over group manipulation, and then we're going to go over permissions. So as we continue, we're going to keep referring to this file to see various changes. But there's actually a command that I would also like to go over with you before. There's a few more that allow you to add and remove users from groups. But this one's pretty useful. It's actually like, has multiple tools available to it, and this is the usermod command. Now, this is a flexible command that enables you to add and remove users to a group. And you also can do other things, such as change their primary group. You can change their home directory and their username. So this is a very flexible tool. And before we get started, actually, we'll do a little quick review of the last episode, because if we do ls home here, we'll see that there's only one user, because when I make a user, I make the default directory home, so we would see if there's another user here. So we're going to actually add a user real quick, so we can then assign them to a group, remove them from a group, and I'll show you some other things that we got going on. So in this case, let's real quick. If you remember from the prior episode, you could either use user add or add user. And add user is not available on all distributions, but it's a little more convenient. So I'm going to be using that here today. So we'll do sudo add user test user. And then password, the password doesn't really matter in this point. It's just a quick example user that we're going to remove as a resource once the episode is over. We'll give them a name, sure. You'll hit enter a couple times, get through this information, yes. And notice that it actually creates a group for example here, it says adding user test user to group users. So it actually adds this user. The add user command knows to add this user to the group of users. So actually, real quick, if we go check the file real quick, we do cat etc group, and notice actually before we scroll up to look at the users group, notice down here creating a user actually created a group for that user, a particular group for that user based on their username that you could then assign resources to that group. So that's something that you want to keep in mind, is when you're creating users, you're also creating groups for them typically. Now if we scroll up and we go to the users column, which I'll highlight here, notice there's a new user in the user list. Prior, we only had T Nider, which is my user account, but now we also have test user. So by default, these users are added to this group of users. But if we continue to scroll up, you'll notice, for example, sudo, it's not been added to sudo because that's for safety, for security. Why would we want that account to be added to sudo by default? We don't. Unless you want to explicitly add them to sudo, in which case we could do if we wanted. Now, before we continue, we're going to clear the console here, and I'm actually going to show you exactly how to add a user to a group or remove them from a group. Now, in this case, you could use usermod and we'll go over usermod here in a moment. But before we go over usermod, which is a little more flexible, let's use the gpassword command in order to remove a user from a group. So let's go ahead and use the manual on that command so we can learn more about it. And this is how it would be typed here. Not full password, just gpasswd. Now let's hit enter. As you can see, this lets you administer groups, and gshadow is similar to the shadow file that we went over in our last episode that goes over user files, and it can show things such as, you know, their passwords and a SHA-1 hash that's salted, or not a SHA-1 hash, excuse me, a SHA hash that's salted. And you can see some other information, and it just says administer these groups, and you know, you can do, every group can have administrators, members, and a password. So this is something to keep in mind when you're creating groups. You know, you may want to have some groups have a default administrator. You may want to assign a password to some groups. This can allow for access control lists that prevent users from doing certain things right away. If you assign them to a group, they may not have full permissions over your system, you know. You might want to have a power user group that has special permissions to do extra things above a typical user, but they still can't edit like root files and so on. You may assign a password to that group so that not just anyone could join that group, or even if they did somehow join that group, there'd be a password, so an extra level of security there. Now if we go down, you can see we can add a user to a named group. We can remove a user from a group. You can get information. You could remove a password from a group, see the list of administrator users of a group, and so on. Even members. So let's go ahead and clear here. And this command's very useful, but in this case we're just going to use a simple example where we're going to add the user, the test user, to the pseudo group, and then we're going to remove them from the pseudo group thereafter. So let's go ahead and do sudo g password, and then we're going to add test user. In this case we're using the -a in order to be explicit that we're adding the user. We could do -d here if we were removing them, and in this case it goes username and then it goes the group. So we'll do sudo. As you can see, it says adding user test user to group sudo. Now real quick, let's check that file again and see if sudo has been updated with the user list. And as you can see, it has. This user now would have administrative privileges because they're added to the sudo group. They can run sudo commands and get that elevated root permission in order to make changes anywhere in the system. Now let's go ahead and remove this user because we don't want this user to be in this group for security reasons. You know, so let's go ahead and remove them, especially if they have a weak password. That might be something you want to keep in mind, is password management, which we may go over at some point. Now let's go ahead and do sudo g password, and then this time we're going to do -d or -d for delete. And it's the same thing. We'll take the user, test user, and here instead of the group to add, it's the group to remove, and we're going to remove the pseudo group. And actually, something else I'd like to mention real quick before we go over this, another way to verify what group someone is a part of is actually the groups command. If we use manual groups, it says print the group of print the groups a user is in. So there's not a whole bunch of options here in terms of adding parameters and so on, but look, it says option username. So here, you know, we're not going to add any options. We'll just say groups test user. Now this will output the groups that the test user is associated with. And you can see it outputs the test user is a part of the test user group. They're a part of the pseudo group, and they're a part of the users group. Now if we remove this user from that group, let's go ahead and do clear. We'll do sudo gpassword, and then we'll remove the user from the group, which in this case it's -d and then user and then the group you wish to remove from that user. It says removing that user from the pseudo group. Now if we do groups and we use test user, you can see that sudo is actually no longer here. And if we wanted to further verify, we could also check out the groups file here. And actually notice that it's still there. So Uh, I think it doesn't fully remove that. Actually, no, that's not what I meant to say. We're going to scroll up. Notice it's not in sudo, so it's not there anymore. And here in a moment, so we remove that user from that group, and here now we're going to remove this user's group, and then we're going to remove that user. So if we wanted to, let's say, add them to a group though, let's go ahead and clear. Let's add them to the group one more time, but this time we're going to be using the usermod command. So my purpose here is to show you that you can use different commands to achieve the same thing. So you could use the gpassword, you could use usermod. There are even other commands that you can do, or you could even do manual entries in your system in order to edit what group someone is a part of. But anyhow, let's go ahead and continue. We're going to actually use the manual on usermod here in order to learn about it. So you can see it says modify a user account. Now this is a very versatile command, and I even thought about mentioning it in the last episode, but it's going to require some explaining when we get started with it, and it's more helpful to have prior knowledge of users. You can see you can actually add users to groups, and you want to do this with the -G option, or hyphen uppercase G, which we'll be doing here in a moment. Then you can see it mentions things like, for example, bad name, allows names that do not conform to standards. So if you had a name that wasn't suited for a user, with this parameter, you'd be able to enable that. And you could also set the user's new login directory, which is actually something we're going to do. You can set an expiration date on the user account for when it expires. It goes on. You could add them to a new user group through their GID. You could add them to groups, and it goes on and on here. You can lock the user. You could do a lot. Change their password. There's a lot of options here. Change their default shell. So this is a very versatile command here, and we're only scratching the surface. We'll go over a couple examples, but so here we're going to do sudo, and we're actually going to add this user to the sudo group once again. So, and this is just to show it as an example, and then we're going to remove them. So we do sudo usermod ag append group, because if you don't use the G parameter, I believe it actually takes over the primary group. So you want to specify that you're adding a group, not that you're changing their primary group, which we'll be going over in a future episode. But as you can see, we're appending the group, and then here would be the group name, which is sudo, and then the username, which is test user. And notice that the parameters here are a little different. Before it would be the user's name and then the group name. In this case, it's the group name and then the username. So it's kind of flip-flopped here. But let's go ahead and hit enter. And now let's go ahead and check the test user's groups. And notice they're now part of sudo. And if we cat the group file and we scroll up, we can see that test user is actually a part of sudo here. So that's another way to add a user. But I would recommend sticking with the gpassword just in order to keep not common naming conventions. It's easy to accidentally change the primary group of a user with usermod and so on. So let's just go ahead and we could remove the group with usermod, but in this case I'm just going to do sudo gpassword, and we're going to remove the test user from the sudo group. And there we go. So now we have their default group and directory, and if we look here in ls home, you can see that the test user actually has a directory there. So when we do add user, it creates, and if you use user add as well, it does this, but you have to specify the directory. But it creates a directory by default for them. Now there are a few things we could do here with usermod. So we have some other options. It's a very strong tool. We'll use clear. And now we could actually change where this user's home directory is, what it's called. And in this case, it'd be with the -d parameter. So we could do sudo usermod -d for the directory. And then here we're specifying the directory prior. And then we'll do the name of the new directory. In this case, we'll say user1. This just emphasizes that that's going to be the home directory. So we'll hit enter. Alright, looks like maybe we typed that wrong here. All right, and I think what happened is we have this backwards here, so we'll do test user, and then what we're actually doing is specifying the new home directory for them. So we'll do user1. All right, and now this actually creates the directory for that user. So if we do ls home, we'll notice that their home directory has actually been renamed to user1. And now if we wanted to change their username in order to match the home directory, we could do sudo usermod, and then we're going to change their name in this case. And first it's going to be the username you want to change it to, and then their current username. And now if we do, for example, if we cat the user file, so what we'll do here is we're going to cat the etc password folder to find out information about the users on the system. And as you can see, actually, you could tell this is the user that we changed because this is the new username. We assigned them a new username, but we did not change the full name attribute on their user profile. And that's why it still says test user here. And it even specifies a new home directory. So if we change the directory, you could go into this file and check to see the contents in order to know if the username has been changed and if the directory has been changed. And there may be other information that you wish to change, but you may have to do this either, I'm not going to show that in this episode, but you'll have to find that out for yourself. Now let's go ahead and clear this, and let's do groups user1. Okay, so we made sure that they're no longer part of the pseudo group. And now there's actually one thing I'd like to do. You may notice as well, they're actually still a part of the test user group. And that's because we didn't create a new user, so there's not a new group. If we cat the group file, we can check, and notice it's still the test user group. So you could use usermod and change all these properties for a user, but know that it's not going to change everything at once. It's not going to change all the common naming conventions for that profile. Instead, you're changing particular attributes of that profile. So let's go ahead and clear this up again. And finally, what I'd like to go over today with you guys is permissions. And simple enough, let's go ahead and do an ls here. And you'll want to do in the list version, because without the list version, it just displays the files and directories in your current folder, which you can find out with present working directory. So here we're in the home folder, in our home folder, which is represented by the tilde here of home/tnider. So we're going to clear, and you're going to want to do ls with the l parameter for a list, so we can see the attributes of the files as well. And we're also going to add a because we want to see all files, right, in this example. So hidden files, which are denoted with the -a parameter, they're found once you use the -a parameter, and they have a period at the front of them. So if we did ls-l, notice all the files that have a period in front of them are missing now. So that's something to keep in mind if you're trying to follow along in this episode and you want to check maybe the hidden files as well. But we're just going to do our typical files. And you actually can notice something here. So we have actually mentioned these attributes here in a prior episode, but we didn't go over them. We just mentioned that, the D is for directory, and we mentioned that this is the user and then group that the item is assigned to. So actually, let's go ahead and do ls-l, and we'll do that on the root directory, which is just /. Now notice these all belong to root. We're looking at each one. The user belongs to his root, and the group it belongs to is root. As we mentioned, root is also a group, not just like a service or a user. Now let's go ahead and clear, and we'll check if we do ls home. We might need to do this as sudo. We'll do sudo ls home user1. Oh, sorry, we need to do / there. And notice there's a test file. Now I actually meant to do -l so we could see their files in a list format. And notice that the user is user1, but it's assigned to the test user group because that's the group that was created on the creation of this file. And you may be wondering what this test file is. Well, in the last episode, we edited a file that allowed for us to update. You know, when you're creating new users, it'll create new files for them by default. And this is something you can set up in your system. If you're interested, check out that last episode, episode 5 for, you know, user management. And this episode is going to be group management. So you could also change ownership for the user and the group. And in this example, we're going to just look at this right here. We're gonna break this down because this actually is the permissions here. So let's go ahead and clear. We'll do ls -l for the root directory. Now I want to point out some things to you here. So you may notice that this has an L, that this one also has an L, and this one has a hyphen. So what exactly are we looking at here in our file system when we see these? Well, notice the ones with an L have a directory that points to another directory. Now, the L's actually refer to a link. So a D is for directory, L is for link, so it could be a soft link or a hard link if you're familiar with those, which just means that, you know, it gets its resources from somewhere else, or it'll take you to somewhere else depending on if it's something you click and so on. And then down here we have the hyphen. Well, notice that this is actually a file here. All the other ones are directories. And some of the directories are links to other directories. Now, the hyphen represents a file in this case. So we can see through these, this is information about the file or directory or the link. And we'll be able to tell which one it is by the first parameter. That parameter is known as the object type, which, as I mentioned, it could be directory, file, or link. And there's actually more information here that we can understand when we break it down. So we can see, so each 3 colons represents a group or a user. And in this case, if we look here, I'll go right to the top, you'll see it says RWX, RWX, and it also says it again. And that's how you would read it. You would read it RWX, not RWX, RWX. Like, it's not one thing. It's actually 3 separate things. And what the first 3 signify, you may notice that they're different here. Like this one says RWX, R-X, R-X. And that's how you would read it. And you could look through all these to see that they all have different properties. In this case, these are permissions. So we have R, which denotes read, W, which denotes write, and then X, which means that you can execute that file. So if you have a read permission, it means you can read that file and read the contents of that directory. If you have write, that means you can add files to a directory, or you can update the file by adding content to it. And if you have execute, that means that you can execute the program that's specified. And as I mentioned before, these are actually 3 different categories. So let's go ahead and clear this. We'll just do ls in our own home. Now what we're looking at here, these are all directories, we can tell by the D. Then we have the first 3 options, the second 3, and then the third set of 3 options. And this first 3 is the user. So these are the user's permissions that owns that file. So tnider, which is our account, has read, write, execute permissions on the desktop directory. So if we had files or an executable in the desktop directory, we would be able to read, write, and execute them as long as they had similar permissions. And these first 3 represents the user, which is the first option here. This is the user column. Now in the next set of 3, we have read, but you can't write, though you can execute. And this is the group permissions. So tnider is also the group here. And there's these third set of permissions that are for everyone. So basically anyone on your machine, and you could also set their permissions by default, so maybe they could only do specific things themselves. but typical users are able to read and execute files in this directory but not write to them, which is what that hyphen means. It's a lack of permission. So let's go ahead and we're going to sudo, let's go ahead and clear first. We're going to sudo the contents and list the directory that is the user1 home directory. And notice that this is not a directory, it's a hyphen. This is the object type, so this is a file. Then we have the next three. So the owner of this file, they can't execute it because it's not a program, it's not an executable, it's just a file. So note that different object types will have different set of permissions typically. And the hyphen is here to represent that we don't have execute permission because you can't execute it in this case. But this, the first three, as we mentioned before, this is the user. So this is user1. And then we have the next three that says you can only read. So the write and execute are hyphens here because you can't have that permission. You don't have that level of control over this file if you're a part of the test user group. So the second set of three is the group, which is test user in this case. And then the last three, as we mentioned, that's everyone. That's all users on your system. So all users can list the contents of this directory as long as they're able to have permission to list this person's directory. Now, as I mentioned, some permissions are explicit because, you know, if we tried to ls, let's say we did it on the home user1, see, we can't do it because the permission's denied. So there are also particular permissions based on, you know, for example, we're not a part of this group and we're not this user, and there's special permissions set upon this folder because this is their home directory for security reasons. So that's why we actually can't read the directory, even though this refers to everyone on the system. Now, we've gone over exactly what the first hyphen means. So it could be, you know, a file, a directory, it could be a link. We went over these. So RWX means read, write, execute. Like R hyphen hyphen, that's only read. If you had R hyphen X, that would be read and execute, but not write. You know, and if we had all three hyphens, that would mean that they do not have any permission to do anything. They can't read, they can't list the contents, they can't execute, they can't write, none of that. So actually today we're going to be going over two commands as well, and it's going to be the change ownership and chmod, which basically says like that you can change what permissions are assigned to a file. So let's go ahead and get started. So here we're going to do chmod, and we're going to change the modifications to the files in our directory. So let's actually create a file real quick. We'll say test file.txt. Then we're going to do ls. And you can see here test file.txt is created. Now let's clear. We'll do the list parameter in order to see, we can see that we're the user assigned to this group, or sorry, we're the user assigned to this file and the group assigned to this file. You can see that information that we went over before. Now, what if we wanted to change the user's ability to have permissions on this file? Like, what if we want the user to be able to execute this file? Well, actually, you can make it where this .txt file is an executable. What we would do here is we would do chmod, and before we do that, let's go ahead and use manual on chmod to learn a little bit about it. Change file bit modes. Now these bit or mode bits, and these mode bits are essentially the parameters that the file has that you input, and it changes the permissions on them. And these actually can be numbers, but they also can be letters, and I'm going to be showing you here, and you could go ahead and scroll through and learn about like various things that are available, but we're not going to be going over that. I hit Q to exit. I'm going to show you hands-on. So we could do something like, let's do ls -l, and keep note of these permissions here. Now if we wanted to change everyone's permission, or other in this case, other is all the other groups, we could do chmod, and then you would do O to signify the other, and then we could add certain parameters, such as, for example, let's say we wanted to add the execute for everyone. So everyone or all the others can execute this file. And we'll do test file.txt. Now let's go ahead and do ls-l again. And notice it's green now. And actually, if you look here, the X has been added, even though up here there is no X. So this is now an executable, and you can run it. Though in this case, it wouldn't necessarily do anything because the contents of the file, there are no contents. And even if there were contents, it has to be something the system could read, or maybe the shell you're using, such as bash. So actually, we're able to add permissions here. For example, I could do chmod, and then we could actually remove the execute with the minus here. We'll do test file.txt. Then we'll clear. So you could do plus or minus to add those permissions. And we'll do ls-l. And notice that it's missing now, and it's all white text, so it's no longer an executable. This is very useful for modifying permissions so only certain people are able to do certain things on. And actually, it's not just for others or for everyone. It's also for group and for user permissions. Let me go ahead and show you. So in this case, we'll do -l, and then I'm actually going to grab the test file so we don't have to see all the output. And notice the permissions here. Now let's say we wanted to add, the execute permission for people that are a part of the tnider group, which is the group that it's assigned to. We could do chmod g. So you actually could use U, G, and O. And users for user, or use for user, G is for group, and O is for other, or for everyone. So we'll do G plus X. So people that are a part of the group that's assigned to this file can now execute it. If we do ls minus, let's just go ahead and hit up twice. And notice the execute is now assigned to this file. If we actually do ls-l, you could see it turned back to green because we're actually a part of this group. So we could execute this if it was an executable, a proper executable, and we wanted to execute it. Now the other thing we can do, is we could change the user permissions. So let's say I wanted to remove all permissions from people that are part of the tnider group. I don't want any of them to be able to do anything with this. We could do chmod, and then we could do, we'll do G minus read, write, execute. And then we'll do, alright, looks like it's just doing an update. Put that in the background. Alright, then we'll do test file.txt. And if we do ls again, let's go ahead and clear it first. Now we'll do ls and grab the file. Notice they have no permissions now. This is the second sector. They have no permissions to read, write, or execute. And you also could do this through octal values, as we mentioned. And these are the mode bits. And read would be 4, write would be 2, and execute would be 1. And essentially, you just add these numbers up. So 7 would mean that you're adding read, write, and execute permissions. If you just wanted read and write, it would be 4 plus 2. So that'd be 6 for read and write, with execute being value of 1, as we said. So 7 would be read, write, and execute. Read and write would be 6. If you wanted to do read and execute, that would be 5, because 4 plus 1 is 5. And let me show you a quick example of this. I'd recommend using the other way. It's a little more readable. But you also can change the information. And the way you do it here, let's say I wanted to change. Actually, let's go ahead. We're going to change the directory to home. We'll do ls. And then I'm actually going to do something here, and I'll explain it. So if we do sudo, actually let's sign into the sudo to save some time here. Alright, now if we change directory into the home directory, do ls. Let's actually clear and then do ls. Now we can see the user1 directory. And if I do a list of the user1 directory, we can see the contents. Now actually, I'm going to show you one thing first. You can change ownership. And that would be through change ownership. And that would be manual change own chown in order to learn about it. It says change file owner and group. So you could do it by the owner owner : group, Or, you could just change who the owner is with the first parameter. And you can see some options here. We're not going to go over everything. We might go over minus capital R or uppercase R, which is for all files in that directory and all directories in that directory. So as I mentioned, as you can see, it says test user 1 is the owner of this, and test user is the group assigned to this. Now if we wanted to change their permissions, we could do sudo, and then in this case, you got to remember it's the chmod, so we'll do chmod real quick. And then, you could do 760. Now what is this right here? 7 is the first 3. So, we have the type of file, the object type, which is a file right now. And then these first 3 are represented by this first number. So 7 is going to give read, write, and execute permission in the first column. 6 is going to give you read and write permission in the second column. And 0 is going to remove all permissions in this column. Let's give it a try. We'll do test file. Let's do test file since that's what it's called. See, it says no file or such directory. Oh, because we're not in that directory. Let's change into that directory real quick, and then we'll run it. Now if we clear and do ls-l, notice it's exactly as we said. We added read, write, execute permissions. It's now an executable because it's green. We added read, write to the second column, and then we removed all permissions from the third. So to do that again, we can go up, and let's say we wanted, maybe we just want read permission and the third for everyone or for other. And then let's say we wanted write only for groups, even though that doesn't make sense, because you want them to be able to read it probably too. And then we'll say, in this case, we'll keep it to read and write. So 624. And now if we do ls-l again, notice the permissions have changed. So that's another way to do it. Now we're going to go over change ownership real quick in this directory so we can see how that works as well. So what we're going to do here is you could do sudo change. Let's actually list the contents first. Alright, and then we'll do sudo change ownership. And then we're actually going to change the ownership of this file to my user, tnider. So we'll do change ownership, then we'll do tnider, and then we'll do test file. And now if we do ls-l, notice I now own that file because we changed the ownership where I am now the owner. My default account is the owner of this file, and I now have these permissions. We could do sudo change ownership back to user 1 in this case, and we'll do test file. Now if we do ls-l, notice it's now user 1 again. If we wanted to change the group, like let's say we just wanted this group to, instead of being the test user group, we want it to be the users group, you could do sudo change ownership. And instead, if you're doing it with change ownership, we're going to go over another command here in a moment, but if you're doing it with change ownership, you want to specify the user and then the group, as I mentioned, with the colon. So here we're going to do, we'll do user 1, and then for the group, we're going to say users, and we'll say test file. So this is going to assign this file to the users group. Let's take a look. Oh, I mistyped test file. Let's go ahead and fix that. And we'll do ls-l. And notice it's now the users group that owns this file. It's a part of the users group. So all users that are a part of the users group will have rights in, we'll go here. They'll have write permissions. So something to keep in mind when you're managing groups and trying to assign permissions. And there's one more command I'd like to go over, which is the change group command. And that's just another way to change group, We'll do manual change group real quick. So you just change group ownership. There are plenty of options, but let's say ls-l. Let's say we wanted to change this back to the test user group. We could do change. Let's do sudo here. Change group, and then we're gonna do test user, and then we'll do test file in order to change the test file back to the test user group. Now if we do ls-l, we now see the test user here. So a lot of exciting stuff. Keep in mind, if you're managing a lot of user accounts, you're going to want to use groups because it simplifies management of users. And you can do all sorts of things, such as assign default permissions, assign default resources, make it where you can secure your machine by adding this extra layer of security through groups. And also, it enables you to automate some things. Like, let's say you have a user group that has files by default or resources that are accessible to users in that group. You could assign, let's say you're doing an onboarding process, and this is your local system that you're running. If you have a developer team, you could add a developer to the developer group and maybe have a program in like a directory that's assigned to that group, and that group can access that directory and they can use that program. Maybe they can make edits to that directory, all sorts of things. So a lot of very useful stuff here, and I hope you learned a lot. We could just type exit here to get out of root, and now we're back in our regular account. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to remove the user account and that group. But, and we could actually do that through group delete. Now I'll go ahead and show that real quick. We'll do group delete. And actually, I don't think it will let me here because user 1 is still assigned to this group. So we'll do test user. Yeah, see, in the group of, see, so we could force this through -F here. And see, now if we cat the etc group file, it's not even there, but it would have been there before. We forced the removal of it. And we could also use user delete, if you're familiar with that command from the last episode, in order to remove user 1. Now if we do ls, keep in mind it keeps their directory because we didn't specify to remove the directory. So you either could look in the manual to check the user delete command in order to remove the directory as well, or you could just remove it by hand, which we'll do here. We'll do sudo remove. And make sure you don't make any typos here. If you're using sudo, it could remove your file system with that /. We'll do home/user1. And now ls, it's gone. So just a quick couple, examples with adding users, removing users, changing user permissions with change ownership, change mod, change group. A lot of very useful stuff here. And please leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed the content today. This video was a little longer than usual, but we went over a lot of information here, and I'm excited to keep uploading these videos and keep, getting out there into the community, reaching out and educating everyone. So, leave some comments if you have any questions, concerns, or, even if you want to see something new. So, look forward to seeing you guys here in the next episode. Stay tuned.